The morning sun cast its golden glow over the quiet suburban streets, painting long shadows that danced as the gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. Margaret adjusted her cardigan and tied the laces of her walking shoes with deliberate care. Her morning walks had become a sanctuary, a ritual she performed religiously since her husband Henry had passed away 2 years earlier. These strolls through her neighborhood were a way to escape the silence of her house and the memories that clung to its walls. The streets were her canvas, familiar yet ever-changing, and she relished the small details. A new flower bed here, a freshly painted door there. But today felt different, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the slight chill in the air, the kind that hinted at the coming autumn, or the restless energy in her legs urging her to take a path she hadn't walked in years. As she turned a corner, Margaret found herself on the edge of her neighborhood, a place she rarely visited. The houses here were older, their facades worn and their gardens less manicured. It was as if time moved slower on this side of the street. Her pace slowed as she absorbed the surroundings, her cane tapping rhythmically on the pavement. She stopped to admire a towering oak tree, its roots spilling out onto the sidewalk like ancient fingers grasping for stability. It was then that her eyes caught something unusual. Hidden behind a dense tangle of overgrown hedges and vines was a faint glimmer of rusted metal. She squinted, taking a few cautious steps forward until the shape became clearer. A gate, wrought iron and intricately designed, its patterns faded but still elegant beneath the rust. It was odd, she thought, that she had never noticed it before. She had walked these streets countless times in her youth, yet this gate felt like a stranger, out of place and shrouded in mystery. The gate seemed almost alive, drawing her closer with an inexplicable pull. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal, and she shivered. It wasn't just the chill. It was something deeper, an unspoken memory she couldn't quite grasp. As she traced the patterns on the gate, a voice startled her from behind. "You shouldn't be there," barked Mr. Hargrove, her reclusive neighbor. He stood across the street, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her step back. "That gate's been locked for a reason. Leave it alone." His voice was gruff, but there was something in his tone, an edge of urgency, almost fear, that piqued her curiosity further. Margaret offered a polite nod, murmuring an apology as she stepped away, but her heart raced. Mr. Hargrove was known for his prickly demeanor and his tendency to keep to himself. He rarely spoke to anyone, and his warning, so out of character, only deepened the mystery. What could be so dangerous about an old gate? As she resumed her walk, her thoughts lingered on the encounter. The rest of her morning was a blur. Even her tea, usually a source of comfort, tasted flat. The image of the gate refused to leave her mind. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a feeling, a whisper that told her the gate held something important, something she was meant to find. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on her bedroom ceiling. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that magnified every creak and groan of the old wood. Her thoughts returned to the gate, to the way it had seemed to call to her. Sleep eluded her, and by the time the first rays of dawn seeped through her curtains, she had made up her mind. She would go back. She had to. The urge was undeniable, a pull she couldn't resist, like the tide answering the moon's call. The next morning, Margaret prepared herself with the precision of someone embarking on an adventure. She slipped on a sturdy pair of gloves, tucked a small flashlight into her coat pocket, and set out. Her steps were quicker than usual, her heartbeat a steady drum of anticipation. As she neared the gate, she glanced around. The street was empty. Mr. Hargrove's curtains were drawn, and his car was nowhere to be seen. She paused in front of the gate, her fingers hovering over the latch. This time, she noticed the faint engravings near the top, initials intertwined with floral patterns. Her breath hitched as a flicker of recognition sparked in her mind. The letters H&M were faint but unmistakable. With a deep breath, she pushed the gate open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound breaking the stillness like a long-forgotten lament. Margaret stepped through, her heart pounding as she entered a world that felt frozen in time. The air seemed heavier here, laden with the scent of damp earth and decay. Overgrown vines coiled around cracked statues and stone benches, their beauty faded but not forgotten. It was a garden, or at least it had been, though neglect had turned it into a shadow of its former self. In the center stood a fountain, its basin dry and its surface covered in moss. Despite its state, Margaret could see it had once been magnificent. She felt a pang of sadness, as if she were mourning something she couldn't name. As she took another step, a flash of sunlight caught her eye. She turned, her gaze landing on an object partially buried beneath the ivy, a rusted key, its ornate design matching the gate's intricate patterns. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. Holding the key, she felt a strange sense of connection, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. Margaret's mind raced with questions. What was this place? Why had it been hidden? And why did it feel like she had been here before? She knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Margaret stood still, clutching the rusted key in her gloved hand, her breath caught between awe and trepidation. The overgrown garden seemed to hum with a quiet energy, a silence so profound it felt like the place was holding its breath, waiting for her to act. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Mr. Hargrove or some unseen witness, but the world outside the gate was oblivious to her presence. Turning back, she felt an unshakable pull, as though the garden itself was urging her forward. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, her cane sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air inside the sanctuary was different, cooler, and filled with a faint scent she couldn't quite place, something between the sweetness of flowers long past their bloom and the bitterness of damp stone. Her eyes scanned a scene, taking in every detail. Stone benches lined the pathways, their surfaces cracked and worn, but their intricate carvings hinted at a time when this place must have been a masterpiece. In the center of it all stood the fountain, its dried basin framed by moss-covered cherubs whose faces were frozen in serene expressions. Margaret couldn't help but wonder how many people had once gathered here, laughing, sharing secrets, or simply sitting in quiet contemplation. It struck her as odd that such a place could exist, tucked away and forgotten, in a neighborhood she thought she knew like the back of her hand. She noticed an archway covered in ivy at the far end of the garden, its keystone adorned with an engraved date, 1927. Her heart skipped a beat. That year rang a faint bell in her memory, though she couldn't place it. She moved closer, brushing aside the ivy to reveal more of the inscription, for H&M, eternally bound. The initials sent a jolt through her, the same one she'd seen on the gate. Her mind raced, conjuring fleeting images of her late husband Henry. Could it be connected to him? But why would he have never mentioned such a place? The questions weighed heavily on her as she stepped through the archway. Beyond it, she found what appeared to be a small sitting area, shielded from view by a canopy of ancient oak trees. There, nestled between the roots of one particularly massive tree, lay a stone slab covered in moss. Margaret hesitated, her instincts screaming that this was a place of importance, a threshold she wasn't sure she should cross. But the key in her hand seemed to burn with purpose, and her curiosity won out. She knelt carefully, her knees protesting, and began to brush away the moss. The words etched into the stone emerged slowly, one letter at a time. Here lies the past we could not keep. The cryptic message sent a chill down her spine. She sat back, staring at the inscription, her mind swirling with possibilities. Was it a grave? A memorial? Or something else entirely? Margaret was no stranger to mystery novels, but this felt different, too real, too personal. The key in her hand seemed to grow heavier, and she realized it must fit something nearby. She scanned the area until her eyes landed on a small metal box, barely visible beneath a tangle of roots. Her pulse quickened as she reached for it, her gloved fingers struggling to dislodge it from the earth. When it finally came free, she saw that it was intricately designed, matching the patterns on the gate and the fountain. She inserted the key, her hands trembling. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, and Margaret hesitated for a moment, bracing herself. Inside, she found a collection of items: a faded photograph, a delicate lace handkerchief, and small leather-bound journal. She picked up the photograph first, holding it close to her eyes. It showed a young couple standing in the very garden she was sitting in. The man bore a striking resemblance to her late husband Henry, though younger and with a carefree smile she barely recognized. The woman beside him was unfamiliar but undeniably beautiful, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders as she leaned into him. Margaret's throat tightened. She set the photograph down carefully, her hands now reaching for the journal. The leather was worn, the edges frayed, but as she opened it, she was struck by the neat, flowing script inside. The entries were dated, starting in 1926, and the words told a story of forbidden love, secret meetings, and a garden that served as their sanctuary. Her eyes scanned the pages, and a name leapt out at her: Henry. Her Henry. The entries described him vividly, his laugh, his kindness, and the way he had promised to leave everything behind for her. But the woman writing the journal wasn't Margaret. She was someone else entirely. A sharp pang of betrayal cut through her, followed quickly by confusion. This couldn't be real. She flipped through the pages frantically, searching for answers, her breath growing shallow as the story unfolded. The journal's final entry was dated mere months before Margaret and Henry had met. It spoke of heartbreak, of a choice that tore them apart, and of a secret that would remain buried forever in the garden they had built together. Margaret closed the journal, her hand shaking. The garden wasn't just a forgotten piece of the neighborhood's history. It was a piece of her own history, one she had never known existed. As she sat there, the weight of the discovery pressed down on her. Questions filled her mind, each one heavier than the last. Why had Henry never told her about this? What had happened to the woman who wrote the journal? And what would she do with this knowledge now that she had unearthed it? The garden, once a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth, its shadows whispering secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Margaret knew one thing for certain: she couldn't leave it alone. Not yet. Not until she had answers. Margaret sat in the overgrown garden, the weight of the leather-bound journal pressing heavily in her lap. The photograph still lay beside her, its edges curling slightly in the damp air. She couldn't stop staring at the smiling couple, the young man who looked so much like her late husband Henry, and the mysterious woman who clearly wasn't her. The journal seemed to pulse with the weight of the past, its frayed leather edges almost daring her to delve deeper. Margaret hesitated, her gloved fingers resting lightly on its cover. Part of her wanted to close it, to shove it back into the rusted box, and pretend she had never found it. But the pull of the unknown was stronger. She needed answers, and she knew the journal held them. Opening it again, she turned to the first entry. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate, the kind of script that suggested care and education. The date at the top read April 12, 1926, and the opening line was as poetic as it was haunting. Today, the garden became ours, a secret shared by only the trees and the stars. Margaret's breath hitched as she read on. The journal described a young woman named Eleanor, who had recently moved into the neighborhood with her family. Eleanor wrote of feeling stifled by her parents' expectations and longing for freedom. Her refuge became the garden, a place she stumbled upon while exploring. The way Eleanor described it, the vibrant blooms, the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, the sound of birdsong, painted a picture of a garden far different from the one Margaret now sat in. It had once been a place of life and beauty, a sanctuary where the world's troubles melted away. Then came the mention of Henry. Margaret's fingers tightened on the edges of the journal as she read the description of their first meeting. He was not the older, steady man Margaret had known, but a brash and passionate young artist who had stumbled upon Eleanor in the garden while sketching the fountain. The words leapt off the page. He was unlike anyone I'd ever met, with a fire in his eyes that made me feel seen for the first time. He didn't ask permission to sit beside me. He simply did, as though he belonged there, as though we belonged together. Margaret's chest tightened, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. There was a romanticism to Eleanor's words that she couldn't deny, but there was also a sharp sting of jealousy and betrayal. This was her Henry, her husband, yet this side of him was a stranger to her. She turned the pages slowly, each entry painting a picture of a deepening bond between Eleanor and Henry. They shared secrets, dreams, and promises whispered beneath the shade of the oak trees. The journal entries grew more intimate, recounting moments of laughter and stolen kisses. But they also revealed the challenges the couple faced. Eleanor's family disapproved of Henry, deeming him unsuitable for their daughter. They saw him as an artist with no steady income, someone who couldn't provide the stability Eleanor deserved. Eleanor's parents forbade her from seeing him, but the garden became their escape, a world where they could be themselves without judgment. Margaret's eyes blurred as she read, her emotions swinging between sadness, anger, and an odd sense of understanding. She could see why Henry had fallen for Eleanor. Her words were filled with vitality, with a longing for freedom and passion that mirrored Henry's own. But why had he never mentioned her? Had she been just a fleeting chapter in his life, or had she left a scar too painful to revisit? As Margaret reached the latter pages of the journal, the tone shifted. Eleanor's entries grew shorter and more frantic, her words laced with heartbreak. She described arguments with her parents, threats of being sent away, and the unbearable weight of societal expectations. The last full entry was dated July 2nd, 1927, and it chilled Margaret to the core. Henry wants us to run away together, but I can't. I love him, but I can't abandon my family. Tomorrow, I'll meet him in the garden one last time and tell him goodbye. I only hope he can forgive me. Margaret closed the journal, her hands trembling. Eleanor's pain was palpable, her words echoing in Margaret's mind like the mournful toll of a bell. She sat in silence, staring at the fountain that had once been a witness to their love. What had happened after that final meeting? Had Henry forgiven Eleanor? And why had he chosen to marry Margaret just a few years later, never once mentioning this chapter of his life? Her thoughts were interrupted by a glint of metal beneath the ivy near the fountain. Curious, she pushed the leaves aside to reveal a small tin box, its lid sealed tightly. She pried it open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to Eleanor, all written in Henry's unmistakable hand. Margaret's heart ached as she unfolded the first one, the words hitting her like a tidal wave. My dearest Eleanor, I can't let you go. The garden may be ours, but my heart belongs to you entirely. If you leave, you'll take the best part of me with you. Please meet me tomorrow and let us decide our future together. Tears blurred Margaret's vision as she read letter after letter, each one filled with Henry's longing, his desperation, and his undying love for Eleanor. The last letter, however, was different. It was dated July 3rd, 1927, the day after their supposed farewell meeting. The words were fewer, but their weight was immense. Eleanor, I understand now. You chose them, and I must respect that. The garden will remain, but I can't. It's time for me to move on, though I'll carry you with me always. Farewell. Margaret let the letter fall to her lap, her tears flowing freely. She felt as though she had stumbled into a world she was never meant to see, a past that had been carefully buried but refused to stay hidden. The garden wasn't just a relic of the neighborhood's history. It was a monument to a love that had shaped Henry's life and, in turn, hers. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sanctuary, Margaret gathered the journal and letters, her heart heavy with questions. She knew she couldn't stop here. This was just the beginning of a journey she hadn't asked for, but felt compelled to take. The truth demanded to be uncovered, and Margaret, for all her trepidation, was determined to find it. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the journal and letters spread out before her, illuminated by the warm glow of a single lamp. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. She had spent hours poring over Eleanor's words and Henry's letters, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that had lain dormant for nearly a century. The weight of the discovery was almost unbearable. This wasn't just a forgotten love story. It was his story, her husband's story, and by extension hers. Yet it was a story he had never shared, a chapter of his life that had remained locked away, hidden as carefully as the garden itself. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the photograph she had found in the box. Henry's youthful face stared back at her, his smile carefree and full of life. She traced his image with her fingertips, trying to reconcile the man in the picture with the one she had known. The Henry she remembered had been steady, reliable, and deeply kind, but he had also been guarded in ways she now understood were more profound than she had realized. He had always avoided talking about his early years, brushing off her questions with vague answers or a quick change of subject. Margaret had assumed it was because he had nothing to say. Now she knew better. The letters, especially the last one, haunted her. "It's time for me to move on, though I'll carry you with me always." Had he truly moved on, or had Eleanor's memory remained a shadow in their marriage, a secret companion in their shared life? Margaret felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she had been some kind of consolation prize, a second choice after the woman he had truly loved. The thought stung, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. But another part of her, a quieter, more compassionate voice, reminded her that she and Henry had shared decades together, raising children, building a life. Surely that had meant something. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, she glanced at the clock. It was well past 8, an unusual hour for visitors. She rose slowly, her knees protesting, and made her way to the door. Standing on her porch was Mr. Hargrove, his face lined with an expression that was equal parts concern and determination. He held a flashlight in one hand and a thermos in the other, as if he had been out walking and decided to stop by. "I figured you'd still be up," he said gruffly, his eyes flicking past her to the warm light spilling from the kitchen. "Mind if I come in?" Margaret hesitated but stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. They hadn't exchanged more than pleasantries in years, and his sudden visit felt oddly timed. Mr. Hargrove set the thermos on the counter and took a seat at the table without waiting for an invitation. His gaze landed on the journal and the letters, and a shadow crossed his face. "You found it," he said simply, his voice heavy with something Margaret couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or resignation. Margaret nodded, her fingers tightening around the back of her chair. "You knew about the garden," she said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Hargrove sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I did. My family's been keeping an eye on it for years. My grandmother was friends with Eleanor. She used to tell me stories about her when I was a boy, about how much she loved that garden, how it was her sanctuary. When Eleanor passed, my grandmother promised to keep it safe, to let it rest." "Rest?" Margaret echoed, her voice sharp. "You make it sound like it's a grave." "In some ways, it is," Mr. Hargrove replied quietly. "Not in the literal sense, but in what it represents. Eleanor poured her heart into that place. When she couldn't be with Henry, She made the garden her refuge. After she died, my family decided it was best to let it fade away, to let the past stay buried. Margaret felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. And what about me? Did you think I didn't deserve to know the truth? That I couldn't handle it? It wasn't my place, he said, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that made her falter. It wasn't anyone's place. Henry made his choice when he left that garden behind. He chose you, Margaret. He built a life with you. That garden, Eleanor, it was a part of him, yes, but it wasn't the whole of him. His words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Margaret turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Henry's love for her had been real, not some pale imitation of what he had felt for Eleanor. But the evidence on the table told a different story. The letters, the journal, they spoke of a passion and a connection that Margaret had never known with Henry. It wasn't fair, she thought bitterly. She had given him everything, and yet she had been living in the shadow of a love she hadn't even known existed. Mr. Hargrove stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "You can do what you want with it," he said, gesturing to the journal and letters. "But just remember, the past is the past for a reason. It's not always kind to dig it up." After he left, Margaret sat alone at the table, staring at the remnants of a story that wasn't hers but had shaped her life nonetheless. She thought of Henry, of the quiet moments they had shared, the way he had held her hand when she was afraid, the way he had kissed her forehead every night before bed. Were those moments real, or were they shadows of a man trying to forget? As the hours ticked by, Margaret made a decision. She would return to the garden, not to bury the past, but to confront it. There was more to the story, she was sure of it, and she wasn't ready to let it go. The truth, no matter how painful, was hers to uncover. She owed it to herself and to Henry to know the whole story. The morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of day where even the sunlight seemed reluctant to break through the clouds. Margaret stood at her kitchen sink, staring out at the street while the kettle hissed softly on the stove. Her mind was restless, caught in a tug of war between anger and curiosity. Mr. Hargrove's visit the previous night had left her with more questions than answers. The idea that he had known about the garden, about Eleanor, and had chosen to keep it hidden gnawed at her. Who was he to decide what she should or shouldn't know about her husband's past? And yet, as much as she resented his interference, a small part of her wondered if he had been right. Some truths, once uncovered, could never be reburied. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp whistle of the kettle. She turned off the stove, pouring the boiling water over a tea bag and watching the amber tendrils swirl in the cup. The simple act of making tea usually calmed her, but today it did little to ease the tension in her chest. The journal, the letters, and the photograph lay on the table, their presence almost accusatory. She needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Margaret grabbed her coat and scarf, the damp chill of the morning seeping into her bones as she stepped outside. The walk to Mr. Hargrove's house was short, but each step felt weighted with uncertainty. When she reached his door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass knocker. For a moment, she considered turning back. What would she even say? But the memory of the garden, of the secrets it held, pushed her forward. She rapped sharply on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. It took a moment, but eventually the door creaked open. Mr. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of surprise and resignation. He was dressed in a thick sweater and slacks, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "Margaret," he said, his voice gruff. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The house was warm, the air scented with wood smoke and something faintly spicy, cinnamon, perhaps. Mr. Hargrove gestured for her to sit in the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. Margaret took a seat on the worn leather couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The way the unspoken filled the room, thick and oppressive. Finally, she broke the silence. "You knew about the garden," she said, her voice steady but edged with accusation. "You knew about Eleanor." "About Henry." Mr. Hargrove sighed, setting his coffee mug on the side table. "I did," he admitted. "Not everything, but enough." "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "All these years, and you never thought I deserved to know?" "It wasn't my story to tell," he said simply. "Henry made his choice to leave it behind. He built a life with you. I figured maybe it was better that way." "Better for who?" Margaret snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "For me? To live my whole life in ignorance? Or for you, so you could keep your promise to someone who isn't even here anymore?" Mr. Hargrove's gaze softened, a flicker of something, remorse, crossing his face. "I wasn't trying to hurt you, Margaret. I thought I was doing the right thing, letting sleeping dogs lie. But maybe I was wrong." His admission took the wind out of her sails, and for a moment she just sat there, the anger draining from her like a deflated balloon. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "I don't understand," she said, her voice quieter now. "Why would Henry keep this from me? Did he still love her? Was I just a replacement?" Mr. Hargrove shook his head. "I can't answer that. But I do know this: Henry adored you. Anyone with eyes could see that. Whatever he had with Eleanor, it ended long before you came into the picture. Maybe he kept it from you because he didn't want to tarnish what you had. Or maybe he was just trying to protect you. Who knows?" Margaret bit her lip, her thoughts churning. She wanted to believe him, but the doubts lingered, clawing at the edges of her mind. "There's more to this," she said finally. "The garden, the journal. It's not just about Eleanor. There's something else. Something bigger." Mr. Hargrove hesitated, his eyes flicking to the fire. "You're not wrong," he said after a long pause. "The garden, it's more than just a love story. It's a piece of this neighborhood's history, of its soul. And your family, Henry's family, they were tied to it in ways most people don't know." "What do you mean?" Margaret pressed, her heart pounding. Mr. Hargrove sighed again, leaning back in his chair. "Back in the day, this neighborhood was different. It wasn't just houses and streets. It was a community. People took care of each other, shared what they had. The garden was a symbol of that. Eleanor and Henry, they weren't just keeping it for themselves. They were trying to preserve something bigger, something that mattered to everyone." Margaret frowned, trying to piece together his words. But if it was so important, why let it fall apart? Why hide it? "Because people change," Mr. Hargrove said simply. "Priorities shift. And sometimes it's easier to forget than to fight to keep something alive." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Margaret stared at him, a knot of unease tightening in her chest. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she knew one thing for certain: there was more to this story, and she wasn't done uncovering it. As she rose to leave, Mr. Hargrove called after her. "Margaret," he said, his tone softer now. "Be careful. The past has a way of taking more than it gives." She paused in the doorway, her gaze steady. "I'm not afraid of the past," she said. "I'm afraid of not knowing the truth." With that, she stepped out into the cold morning air, the weight of the garden's secrets pressing heavier on her shoulders than ever before. But despite the uncertainty, one thing was clear: she wasn't turning back. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were restless ones for Margaret. The discovery of the garden, Eleanor's journal, and Mr. Hargrove's cryptic words weighed heavily on her. Each morning, she would wake with a plan to confront the secrets head-on, but by evening, She would find herself sitting at her kitchen table, the journal unopened and the letters neatly stacked, unable to take the next step. She wasn't afraid of the truth, not exactly, but she wasn't sure what she would do with it once she uncovered it. Would it bring her closure, or would it unravel everything she thought she knew about her life with Henry? Her children had called her during the week, as they often did, but she found herself brushing them off with vague reassurances that everything was fine. How could she explain to them what was unfolding? How could she tell them that their father, the man they had idolized, had lived a life she barely recognized? It wasn't just Henry's legacy on the line. It was the foundation of their family. The thought filled her with a deep, gnawing unease. Finally, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Margaret decided she couldn't sit in limbo any longer. Armed with the journal, the letters, and a thermos of tea, she returned to the garden. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at winter's approach, and the sky was an unbroken expanse of gray. She paused at the gate, her fingers lingering on the rusted metal. It felt different this time, not a barrier, but an invitation. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The garden was as she had left it, its overgrown paths and moss-covered statues exuding a quiet, melancholic beauty. Margaret walked slowly, her cane tapping softly against the stones, until she reached the fountain. She sat on one of the cracked benches, placing the journal and letters beside her. For a long moment, she simply stared at the fountain, her mind swirling with questions and doubts. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, she opened the journal to the final entry and began to read it aloud. Her voice, though shaky at first, grew steadier with each word. The garden seemed to absorb the sound, the wind carrying her voice through the trees. As she read, she felt an unexpected connection to Eleanor, a woman she had never met but who now felt like an old friend. Eleanor's heartbreak, her love for Henry, and her ultimate decision to let him go resonated deeply with Margaret. She realized that Eleanor hadn't been trying to take anything from her. If anything, Eleanor had given Henry back to the world, allowing him to find a new path and new love. By the time she finished the final words, Margaret's cheeks were damp with tears. She set the journal down and wiped her eyes, her heart heavy but strangely light at the same time. For the first time since discovering the garden, she felt a sense of clarity. Henry's love for Eleanor had been real, yes, but so had his love for Margaret. The two weren't mutually exclusive. People were complicated, their hearts capable of holding multiple truths at once. As she sat there, the sound of footsteps startled her. She turned to see Mr. Hargrove approaching, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. He nodded in greeting, his expression unreadable. "Figured I'd find you here," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Margaret gestured for him to sit, and he lowered himself onto the bench beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the rustling of leaves. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "I think I understand now," she said, her voice steady. "Why Henry never told me. Why you and your family kept the garden hidden." Mr. Hargrove tilted his head, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you?" he asked, not unkindly. Margaret nodded. Henry loved her, and she loved him. But life doesn't always give us the endings we want. They had to let each other go. And maybe that's why he was able to love me the way he did. Because he had already learned what it meant to lose something precious. Mr. Hargrove studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You're a wise woman, Margaret," he said. "Wiser than most. Some people spend their whole lives trying to make sense of the past and never come close." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of the garden's history settling between them. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "I think I need to share this," she said, gesturing to the journal and letters. "Not just with my family, but with the neighborhood. This garden, it's more than just Henry and Eleanor. It's part of all of us. People deserve to know." Mr. Hargrove hesitated, then nodded. "If anyone can do it justice, it's you," he said. Margaret smiled faintly, her resolve hardening. She wasn't sure how she would go about it, whether she would host a gathering, write an article, or simply invite people to visit the garden. But she knew she had to try. The secrets of the past had lingered in the shadows for too long. It was time to bring them into the light. As she left the garden that day, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The past would always be a part of her, of Henry, of the garden, but it didn't have to define her. She had reconciled with it, and in doing so, she had found a new sense of purpose. Whatever came next, she was ready. The days that followed Margaret's return to the garden were a blur of preparation, contemplation, and quiet determination. She had decided firmly and without hesitation that the story of the garden needed to be shared, not just with her family, but with the entire neighborhood. The garden was more than a relic of her husband's past. It was a monument to a time when life was simpler, when neighbors leaned on one another, and when love, even if fleeting, had the power to transform lives. Margaret felt it was her responsibility to give the garden its voice back, to let its secrets breathe in the open air rather than fester in forgotten corners. Her first step was to write letters. Margaret had always preferred pen and paper over phone calls or emails, finding comfort in the deliberate act of writing. She crafted each letter with care, addressing them to her neighbors and inviting them to a gathering in the garden. She didn't reveal the details of her discovery, only hinting that the garden held a story worth hearing and a history worth remembering. As she sealed each envelope, she felt a nervous flutter in her chest. Would anyone come? Would they even care? The morning of the gathering dawned bright and crisp, the kind of day that carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and promised a cool evening. Margaret arrived early to the garden, armed with a thermos of tea, a basket of cookies, and the journal and letters. She had spent the previous evening tidying the space as best she could, trimming the overgrown vines and brushing the moss from the stone benches. It was still wild and untamed, but she thought Eleanor would have appreciated the effort. As the hour of the gathering approached, Margaret felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She paced near the fountain, glancing repeatedly at the gate. What if no one came? What if she had misjudged the neighborhood's interest? But then, faint voices reached her ears, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Margaret turned to see a small group of neighbors entering the garden, their faces a mix of curiosity and warmth. Among them was Mr. Hargrove, his usual stoic expression softened by something Margaret couldn't quite place. Approval, perhaps, or relief. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her nerves. She gestured for them to sit, and soon the garden was filled with quiet murmurs and the occasional rustle of leaves. Once everyone had settled, Margaret stood near the fountain, the journal in her hands. "This garden has been a part of our neighborhood for decades," she began. "But for a long time, its story was hidden, buried under vines and secrets. Today, I want to share that story with you." She opened the journal, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to read. She started with Eleanor's earliest entries, describing the garden's creation and its role as a sanctuary. As Margaret read, she watched the faces of her neighbors transform. Expressions of curiosity gave way to understanding, and some even showed tears. When she reached the passages about Eleanor and Henry, she hesitated for a moment, her voice catching. But she pressed on, her words steady and clear, weaving the tale of their love, their heartbreak, and the choices that had defined their lives. When she finished, the garden was silent, the weight of the story settling over the group like a gentle, melancholic blanket. Margaret looked up, meeting the eyes of her neighbors one by one. "This garden isn't just about Eleanor and Henry," she said. "It's about all of us. It's a piece of our shared history, a reminder of the connections we've forgotten and the love we carry with us, even when it's hidden." For a moment, no one spoke. Then an older woman named Linda, who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly as long as Margaret, stepped forward. "I used to play here as a little girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never knew its story, but I always felt there was something special about this place. Thank you, Margaret, for bringing it back to us." Others began to share their own memories of the garden. Childhood games, stolen moments of solitude, and even a long-forgotten proposal beneath the oak tree. The air was filled with laughter and tears, the kind of raw, unfiltered emotion that Margaret hadn't seen in years. It was as if the garden itself had come alive again, its long silence voice finally heard. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the sanctuary, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. The garden's story was no longer a secret, and its beauty was no longer hidden. It had become what was always meant to be, a place of connection, reflection, and love. And though Margaret still carried questions about Henry, about Eleanor, and about the choices they had made, she felt a new sense of clarity. The past was the past, but it had shaped her present in ways she was only beginning to understand. When the gathering ended, Margaret lingered in the garden, the journal resting in her lap. Mr. Hargrove approached her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You did good today," he said gruffly, but there was a warmth in his tone that made Margaret smile. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "This garden belonged to all of us. It still does." He nodded, his gaze drifting to the fountain. "Funny thing about the past," he said. "Sometimes it's not just about remembering. It's about letting go." Margaret considered his words, her fingers tracing the journal's worn cover. She didn't know if she would ever fully let go of what she had discovered, but for now she was content. The garden had found its voice, and in doing so, it had helped her find hers. The weeks after the gathering brought a sense of renewal to Margaret and the neighborhood. The garden, once a forgotten relic, had transformed into a place of connection and meaning. Neighbors came together to clear the overgrown paths, restore the fountain, and plant new flowers. Margaret found solace in these shared efforts, her days filled with laughter and purpose that had been missing for so long. Yet, despite the garden's revival, a lingering question remained unanswered, a question that gnawed at Margaret in the quiet hours of the night. What had become of Eleanor? Margaret had tried to uncover more about her, scouring old neighborhood records and asking the elderly residents who might have known her. But Eleanor's trail seemed to vanish after her final journal entry. It was as if she had stepped out of the garden and disappeared into thin air. Margaret told herself that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, but deep down, she felt that the story wasn't over yet. Her intuition proved correct one crisp November morning when she received an envelope in the mail. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, elegant, and deliberate, addressed simply to Margaret H., care of the garden. There was no return address. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a single sheet of aged stationery. The note was brief but stunning in its implications. "Dear Margaret, you don't know me, but I know of you. My name is Eleanor Grace Wilson, and I am the granddaughter of the Eleanor who wrote the journal you found. I was told about the garden many years ago, but I never knew where it was. My grandmother left me her letters, and when I heard about your gathering, I realized it must be the same place. I believe we are connected in more ways than one, and I would like to meet you. Sincerely, Eleanor Grace." Margaret read the letter 3 times before she could fully comprehend its meaning. Eleanor had a family. Her love for Henry hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of another. The implications sent Margaret's mind racing. Could it be possible that Henry was somehow tied to Eleanor's descendants? The thought sent a chill down her spine, a mixture of fear and excitement. She knew she had to meet this woman, if only to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. They arranged to meet the following week in the garden. Margaret arrived early, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. She had spent the morning replaying Henry's letters in her mind, wondering what truths might finally be revealed. When she heard the sound of approaching footsteps, she turned to see a tall, poised woman in her 40s, her dark curls and sharp cheekbones a haunting echo of the Eleanor described in the journal. She carried an old leather bag, which she clutched tightly as she approached. "Mrs. H?" the woman asked, her voice soft but confident. "Please call me Margaret," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "And you must be Eleanor Grace." The woman smiled, and for a moment, Margaret felt as though she were looking into the past. They sat together on one of the benches, the fountain murmuring softly in the background. Margaret felt a nervous flutter in her chest, unsure of where to begin. Fortunately, Eleanor Grace seemed to sense her hesitation. "I want to thank you for taking care of the garden," she said. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about it when I was a child. It was her favorite place in the world, though she rarely spoke of why." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the journal's secrets. "I think I know why," she said, her voice soft. She handed Eleanor Grace the journal, watching as the younger woman's eyes widened with recognition. Eleanor Grace leafed through the pages slowly, her fingers tracing the elegant script. "These are her words," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've seen her letters, but this is her heart." For the next hour, they spoke of Eleanor, of Henry, and of the garden that had bound their stories together. Margaret hesitated before sharing the letters, unsure if she had the right to reveal such intimate pieces of Henry's life. But Eleanor Grace met her gaze with quiet determination. "I think we both need to know the whole truth," she said. As Eleanor Grace read Henry's letters, her expression shifted from curiosity to sadness, and finally to quiet resolve. When she reached the final letter, the one in which Henry said goodbye to Eleanor, she paused, her hands trembling. "He loved her," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "But he let her go. And she let him go too. They both chose to live the lives they were meant to live." Margaret nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I used to think love was simple," she said, "that you could only truly love one person. But I think Henry taught me otherwise. He loved her, yes, but he loved me too. And maybe that's okay." Eleanor Grace reached into her bag, pulling out a photograph. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, handing it to Margaret. It was a picture of Eleanor in her later years, sitting in a garden that bore a striking resemblance to the one they now sat in. In her lap was a small child, a boy with dark curls and bright eyes. Margaret felt a jolt of recognition. "That boy, he looks so much like my son did at that age," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor Grace smiled faintly. "That's my father," she said. "And yes, I think he and your son might have more in common than we realized." The weight of her words hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Margaret's mind raced, piecing together the implications. Could Henry have been the boy's father? Was Eleanor Grace's family also hers in some distant, tangled way? The realization was both shocking and strangely comforting. The garden had been the beginning of a story, not just for Henry and Eleanor, but for generations to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in golden light, Margaret felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The past had come full circle, its secrets revealed not as burdens, but as gifts. She and Eleanor Grace parted with a promise to stay in touch, their shared connection a testament to the enduring power of love, loss, and the places that hold our stories. For Margaret, the garden was no longer a mystery. It was a sanctuary, a place where the past and present could coexist, where hearts could heal, and where life, even in its messiest and most complicated forms, could flourish.